Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of the Real Estate Mortgage Show. This is episode 45, continuation from last week's episode with regards to conditional offers. We spoke a little bit about whether an offer can be bumped or whether it can't, and why you should and why you shouldn't, and all that kind of stuff. So, anyway, I hope you got a lot out of that, out of last week's show. And we're just going to carry on because I was hoping to cover everything I could in last week's show, but it seemed that all of a sudden my message became very, very long winded. I didn't want to roll it all into one show. I like to try and keep shows, somewhere around the 10 to 15 minute mark at the very, very most. That way you can take advantage of listening to it while you're in the car, or maybe, taking the dog out for a walk, or, that sort of thing. Anyway, so let's carry on with conditional offers. Let's carry on with offers because this time it's not so much the conditional part, but we're going to talk about offers a little more. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is the irrevocable time that is stated in an offer. Okay, so just so you're clear on that, the irrevocability of an offer basically addresses how long the buyer gives the seller to accept the offer as it's written. Okay, now of course you could have an offer from a seller to the buyer, but that's not the point of this conversation here. So the irrevocable time, as I said, is the amount of time that is given to the seller by the buyer in order for him to consider accepting his agreement. Okay, so the irrevocable time, just so you know, it is really only relevant if the offer is acceptable as it's been written. So if the offer is written full price, there's no conditions in it, the closing date is exactly what you want, and you're given until, say, midnight tonight to accept it, then that offer is only binding by both parties if the seller accepts it before midnight. If the seller accepts it after midnight, then the offer is no longer binding to the buyer because he only gave you, or she only gave you, until midnight to accept it. There was a time limit on it for various reasons. There could be, maybe he was considering moving on to something else. Hey folks, it's Walter Montero. Just a quick interruption to this week's show. We all know that real estate is a great investment, but wouldn't it be nice to harness the power of that great investment with your RSP? Well, you can. Your RSP portfolio is not just for stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. You can use your RSP to invest in private mortgages. Private mortgages are secured against real property. In our current market, they can yield as high as 14 to 16% return. How does that stand up to what your current RSP portfolio is doing now? To learn more about RSP mortgage investing, go to rrspmortgageinvestor.com. That's rrspmortgageinvestor.com. Let me show you how you can turn your RSP portfolio into a money magnet. That's rrspmortgageinvestor.com. Now back to the show. As I said, is only relevant if the offer is acceptable as it's written. A little bit of a pet peeve that I have in the real estate business is that when an agent calls me with an offer on one of my listings and says, hey, I've got an offer for you, it's irrevocable till midnight tonight. And so right away they assume that, oh, okay, well, he has to present that offer before midnight tonight. First of all, getting from the rules perspective, it's my job and my obligation to convey offers to the seller as soon as I receive them. Okay, so I can't withhold offers from my seller. I've got to let them know about them. But in terms of the irrevocability, sometimes agents will say, hey, we need an answer. We only gave you till midnight tonight. Well, unless the answer is yes, the irrevocable time is irrelevant. Okay, because if I'm going to be making any changes to that offer, what I've done is I've nullified the offer, and now I'm going to turn around and give the buyer an irrevocable time on my counteroffer, which again will have a time limit, and then the buyer will have a certain window of time to accept that offer within the given period of time, or it is no longer binding by the seller. Okay, so again, irrevocable periods are only relevant if the offer is acceptable as it's written. If it's not acceptable as it's written, it's not a big deal. Okay, so it's not a race in terms of oh my God, this offer is going to blow up if we don't deal within a certain period of time. That's not the case at all. It just means the relevance or the binding portion of the agreement is only applicable if the offer is acceptable as it's written. Okay, so I hope that clears that up on irrevocable times. Deposits. Let's talk about that for a bit. Basically, the deposits are basically the good faith that is presented to the seller from the buyer in terms of the consideration for the agreement. So the deposit is very clearly stated as to how much it is and what happens to it. So deposits, it's funny because if deposits in our area can be anywhere from say $1,000 right up to $50,000. The norm seems to be somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000. That's in our little Cambridge KW market. If you go into the Greater Toronto area, their deposits almost seem to be on par with what the real estate commission is, which, again, commissions are not fixed. But if you're looking around 5%, then it's 5% of the purchase price is the actual deposit. So the deposits are significantly more money. Okay, so I guess the questions that come up in terms of deposits is number one, when are they due? And number two, what happens to them after they've been received? Okay, so basically, a deposit is going to be due as it is stated in the agreement of purchase and sale. So if the agreement of purchase and sale says that the deposit is herewith, then of course the offer comes accompanied with a deposit. If it says upon acceptance, then the deposit is only due upon the acceptance of the agreement. Okay, now here's where the big question comes in, is if I accept an offer with the deposit being stated that it will be given to the seller's agent upon acceptance, what's the time limit in terms of getting that deposit over to the real estate office? And my understanding is that deposits are due within 24 hours of acceptance of the agreement. Okay. Now, is the agreement non-binding if the deposit is not conveyed over to the agent? I guess the answer to that is yes and no. The buyer does have 24 hours to get the deposit over to the next party, but if he doesn't give the deposit over, what they've done is they've actually opened up the ability for the seller to accept another offer and actually squeeze you right out of the situation. So really, in a sense, what you're doing is you're really endangering, the deal because it is no longer binding if the seller doesn't receive the deposit on time. Okay. Now, if they do get the deposit on time or do it even get it after and there was no challenge, then obviously it's still a binding agreement. But those are the risks that a buyer takes if they don't hand over the deposit within 24 hours of acceptance of the agreement. So it's very, very important as to making sure the logistics of that is taken care of properly. The other thing is deposits are typically held within the listing agent's trust account. Okay, so the listing agent's trust account, they have a trust account for deposits. That's where the deposit money is held, and that would be dependent on the outcome of the agreement. If the agreement is conditional and it doesn't end up coming together, from a traditional perspective, deposits are returned back to the purchaser in full and without interest or deduction. Okay. If the agreement becomes firm and binding, then obviously it becomes part of the purchase price and it's credited towards the purchase price. So whatever you agree to pay for that property, you would pay that amount less the deposit that you already conveyed. Okay. Now, with regards to deposits, going back to the buyer, if a deal falls apart, one thing you've got to be clear on is most deposits that we handle are written in the form of a personal check. So when the buyer gives the check over to the agent and says, here's my deposit for $10,000, and by chance the deal falls apart, of course the buyer is going to want his deposit back. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind here is that listing agents are not going to be quick to give you that deposit back until that check clears. Okay, so if you've made a conditional offer for 5 days upon financing and inspection, and it so happens that your deal doesn't end up coming together and you want your deposit back, you are going to get it back. You just may not get it back as quick as you might like it, because checks typically take 10 days to clear. And if the condition was only 5 days long, then, when the deal falls apart, the listing agent doesn't even know that the check is cleared or not. So the last thing he wants to do is give your buyer back, say $10,000 and then find out that the check didn't clear to begin with. Now they're chasing the buyer for money. So something to keep in mind in terms of the logistics of getting the deposit back in the event that the deal falls apart. Okay. Now, in order to prevent all that, if you do want to prevent that, you can hand over the deposit in a couple of different ways. You can either do it by bank draft, or you can do it by money order. We used to be able to do it by cash, and we still can by all means, but as soon as you break that $10,000 mark, then it becomes a whole other kettle of fish. There's a whole bunch of paperwork attached to real estate agents handling that kind of cash, and with money laundering rules and all that kind of stuff. So you're best off dealing with a check, a money order, or a bank draft. Okay, that is the best way to handle deposits. Now, the one other question that comes up with regards to deposits is what happens to the deposit after the deal becomes firm, so in other words, unconditional, and yet the deal doesn't close. So for some reason or another, the buyer has been unable to close a transaction. Well, that money is not released, and that's typically stays in the trust account pending the outcome of any kind of agreement or litigation in terms of how that deposit has to be redistributed after the deal happens to collapse. Okay, so anyway, so that's a little bit on deposits. The last part I want to talk about in terms of an offer is HST. Now, one thing that you'll notice on an agreement of purchase and sale is on the HST clause, it typically says that HST is included in or not included in. Okay, those are the two fields that are the options that an agent has in order to populate the particular field. And a lot of people say, well, HST is not applicable on resale homes. Why does it say included or not included? Not included. Why doesn't it say not applicable? Well, the reason it says included or not included is and not applicable is because we never really know whether HST is included or is applicable or not. So that's why we say included or not included. And the reason we do that is because let's say somebody owns a home and of course it's their residential property, but one thing that they do is they have a home business, and they write off a portion of the house and a portion of the mortgage and a portion of the taxes and all the expenses towards this business. Well, if this house is being used for business purposes, then a portion of the transaction, by technical standards, is HST applicable. Okay? And the last thing you want as a buyer is if you put in that the HST is not applicable. Well, it is applicable. Now, who's going to pay it? It becomes a whole kettle of fish. That's why you always want to put in as a buyer that the HST is included in and as opposed to not included, because you never know how that seller has set up their taxes in terms of how they file. I'll tell you, a few years ago, we sold a fourplex for a friend of ours, and they never did anything with the property. What they did was they bought the property, and they lived in it, but they never rented out any of the other three units. He just kind of tinkered around with it, fixed it up, and then a few years later he decided to sell it. It was a cash on cash investment. He wasn't really looking to make a whole lot of money. He was looking more for a project more than anything else. Well, at the end of the day, we sold this property for him. And of course, this is a residential resale property, which we felt HST was not applicable on. Well, anyway, what ended up happening is the person that bought the property, of course, wrote up the offer with HST being included in. And all of a sudden, a few months later, I should say probably about a year later, the seller contacted us and said, hey, we got a big problem. I just got a bill for HST on that property. And I'm really upset about it. Well, one thing that we knew was, well, that's impossible. HST is not applicable on residential resale property. What the seller didn't tell us was that he had a very creative accountant, and one of the things that he did in order to try and curtail any excess taxes was he had the seller register the property as a bed and breakfast. Apparently, there was some sort of tax benefit to having the property registered as a bed and breakfast. Even though he never did any business with it, because he filed taxes that way, it ended up that the property ended up being subject to HST. So, as I said, with the HST, You never know what kind of lurks in the background there, so be very careful about writing that clause. Of course, with commercial properties, it's always applicable, and so obviously it's going to be not included in. And if it is included, then of course the seller's going to have to take the shortfall. Okay. I hope that helps a little bit in terms of agreements. Again, we're going on a little over 15 minutes here. Anyway, I hope you have a great week. If you have any real estate questions, by all means, you know where to reach us. Have yourself a great week. Thanks again for listening to this week's episode of the Real Estate Mortgage Show. If you have any real estate questions, please direct them to me at 519-624-9222 or walter@maximumresults.ca, or you can find me online at www.cambridgehouses.com. If your interests are in mortgages, please feel free to call 519-624-9222 or email Karen@maximumresults.ca, or you can find her online at www.m as in Mary, R as in Roger, financial.ca. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a great week.